All right, welcome back. We are looking at Islamophobia and the war on terror and really the increased violence on South Asian communities. Now, last time or in one of the other recordings, we talked about, anti-Asian racism and violence, right? And that really was looking at people of East Asian descent because of COVID and back in the day because those were folks who were really immigrating over for labor and other reasons, right? This module, this recording is looking at South Asians and really, um, how 9/11, the event that rocked the United States, it was the impetus of increased violence against those communities. Now, of course, we have to talk about the attack itself. September 11th, this was the day that there was four planes hijacked, right? Most folks remember that one went into the Twin Towers. If you're my age, you may have seen it on TV. I know I did. But if you're younger, I'm sure they've talked about it in school. It's one of the largest attacks on U.S. soil. It's estimated that about 2,977 people died during this day. It was one of the deadliest attacks since Pearl Harbor. Now, what happens after this, right, is really a conflation of religious ideology with race, right? So let's kind of look at the timeline of what happened after we, as a country, were attacked on September 11th. So the next day, Bush declares war on Al Qaeda. This is the group that was blamed for the terrorist attack, the hijacking of the four planes, right? And so, of course, President Bush declares war on Al Qaeda, saying that, um, we are going to fight and win this war, right? We cannot have someone killing our American citizens on our soil. I'm just saying, it's neither here nor there. So the next day, he declares war on Al Qaeda. A few days later, he authorizes the CIA detention program. Now, this is a secret memorandum, right, that grants the CIA new and open-ended authority to capture and detain anyone who it determines poses a continuing serious threat, right, to the United States. Now, how do we know who that is? We're going to target anybody who we think is a Muslim. We'll talk about it more. Before this, though, before this secret memo comes out, basically granting CIA unlimited power, right? The CIA, excuse me, the CIA had very limited ability to detain any individual because of our civil rights, because of our civil liberties granted to us by the U.S. Constitution. But under this program, right, you see that folks were starting to disappear into what they call this global network of black sites, or an unofficial, undisclosed detention and interrogation center. And we all have heard some of the stories about what went on in those spaces, especially very inhumane conditions inhumane tactics and strategies on interrogation, right? And I think about waterboarding. I mean, if you've ever seen an action movie, it's one of the most traumatic things that you can do in an interrogation strategy. And again, this is based on who the CIA thought would be a threat, not who actually was a threat, right? Then, um, the next day, there was another attack uh, via anthrax as a biological attack, right? There was a few people who died as a result of these letters being sent with anthrax, right? And so because it was just a few days after 9/11, there was an assumption that this was another attack, to try and you know another attack on U.S., right? Another attack on U.S. soil. Later, however, after investigation, they found that actually had nothing to do with 9/11, and that it was an American scientist who had letters delivered with anthrax in them, killing about 5 folks, right? So, but before they knew that, they thought it was another attack on US. So Congress then authorizes this broad military response, which essentially gives President Bush unlimited power, right? To use all necessary and appropriate force against those who planned, authorized, committed, or aided the 9/11 attacks, or anyone who harbored anyone who did, right? So just up to this point, right, we're seeing a trend of Congress allowing, and Bush, President Bush, allowing unlimited power, unlimited government power to really violate uh, individuals' civil liberties. Now, before, on the 12th, when he declares war on Al Qaeda, he then on the 20th announces the global war on terror, which means that not only are they targeting this terrorist group Al Qaeda, right, but they're going to target all terrorist groups um, in the world, right, and they're going to quote unquote eliminate them. Now, in order for them to figure out, right, who is a threat against the US, they sign into law this Patriots Act. And so the Patriot Act was legislation that strengthened the federal government's counterterrorism response. It included provisions to bolster cooperation between law enforcement and intelligence agencies. When we talk about intelligence agents, we're talking about the FBI, CIA, right? It also strengthened banking regulations to eliminate terrorist financing, and it created new definitions and penalties for terrorist activities. But what it also did, and again, how this particular law violates, our civil liberties, it allowed for an expansion of domestic surveillance. Now, guess who's being surveyed? And what does surveillance and racial profiling have in common, right? And so, I mean, there's many other ones, but these are the ones I'm highlighting. The last thing I want to highlight is then after they sign this Patriots Act, then they allow, or they create the TSA, which is the Transportation Security Administration, right? And this is not ran by law enforcement or government agencies, right? This is ran by private security companies. And so these are folks who are really not trained for this level of security that, the TSA and airport security, this new group was organized for. And so, of course, again, this is something that we all are very, very familiar with when you go to the airport. If you travel, right, you have to, like, take your computer out now. You have to take off your shoes. This is all as a result. And there is TSA where you're going through airport security, all a result of the 9/11, right? And I think one of the readings talks about some of the racial profiling that TSA does. 100% of the time, people who are wearing headscarves, no matter what kind it is, or what type of religion ideology you follow, 100% of the time they are subject to a second search. 100% of the time they are subject to a second search. So This is some of the timeline of the war on terror from the time of the terrorist attacks on 9/11 to about November 20 or excuse me 2001. So now let's define Islamophobia. So it refers to the fear of Islamic people and the justification of the systematic marginalization of Muslims, right? Muslims are people who follow Islam, the religious ideology. Now, I put it that it started out as a religious discrimination, right? But evolved into this racial and ethnic discrimination because while and this is a quote that I thought, really speaks to the heart of this evolution from religious to racial or ethnic discrimination. And this is by this scholar named Singh in a 2013 article. He says that while physical appearance normally correlates to race in the US, right? In many cases, the visible markers which distinguished the victims of post 9/11 hate crimes were not solely or even primarily racial, but actual religious signifiers, such as the turban or the hijab. In this context, these religious symbols became racialized indicators in the eyes of vigilantes who carried out barbaric assaults. They conflated religious signifiers, specifically religious signifiers, as headscarves, because when we think about Islam, right, we think about the hijabs, we think about the coverings of the head, even though Islam and Islamic people aren't the only religion that covers their head, right? And this is the issue. This is how a lot of people of Hindu and Sikh Sikh religion have been targeted um, based on this concept of Islamophobia. So this is another quote. Um, and so it says, since 9/11, Islamophobia has spread and has targeted groups indiscriminately, meaning it doesn't matter if you're Islamic or not. If you're wearing that headscarf, guess what? We're going to target you. So Sikhs, I hope I'm saying this right, Silks who wear a turban as an article of faith have been mistaken for Muslims in the US. They actually pray at a gurdwara, not a mosque, but one of their religious buildings were vandalized days after the San Bernardino shooting that happened in 2000s. So you can see that even though, folks were upset about the terrorist attack from an Islamic group, not all Islamic people, right, were involved. But it didn't matter as long as you looked like somebody who was Islamic, because we're pretty ignorant here in the U.S. and we don't really talk about, religion and in different religions unless you're going to a religious class, right? Then we're very ignorant around what each religious groups wear. What are their religious signifiers? For example, Christians wear a cross, right? A cross necklace or something like that, right? So all religious groups have signifiers, but again, because we're so ignorant, we don't know the difference between them. And so as a result, I just kind of wanted to let you know that the Sikh religion is not Islamic, right? It's a religion that is a monotheistic, meaning there's one God, religion that originates in the Punjab region of India. Although there are some Muslim Indians, right? They're different from Sikh people, right? Um, and so I just wanted to put that up there so that we are no longer ignorant. But yeah, like there is a difference between religious ideology and the fact that, there was some Punjabi people and some Muslim folks who were in the Twin Towers when it was attacked and who died. That doesn't often get talked about, right? There were people of all religious ideologies that were in that building who were murdered on that day. But we like to just scapegoat and place blame. So before we get into mental health, I want to just show that since 9/11, there has been an increase in violence and discrimination towards the silk communities, right? So you see an increase in hate crimes and school bullying, workplace discrimination, racial and religious profiling. Again, when those two are conflated because of our ignorance of religious ideologies, right? But of course, just like any type of violence, is going to affect people's mental health. And so it has been found in a study that it can negatively influence the health by disrupting many systems. For example, individual stress reactivity and identity concealment, interpersonal social relations and socialization processes, structural institutional processes, and media coverage, right? There is not a lot of scientific data on this topic, but we can be very much sure that as a trauma, violence inflicts trauma, that there is a decline in mental health as a result of the increase of violence within these non-Islamic um, and Islamic communities, right? And so I kind of wanted to end here to really think about how not just, Islamophobia, but just generally anti-Asian racism and violence, how that affects a person's mental health, but not only their mental health, their physical health, because we're all connected. It's not divided in the way that we have done in Western medication, right? So disrupting this system, looking at stress reactivity, right? And identity concealment, that's stress. Stress actually puts pressure on your organs, which then can shut down and you can die. So even if, a person is not murdered as a result of this phobia, right? Or as a result of violence, they could surely enough die from a disruption to their mental health, right? And so we really need to think about this when we talk about this concept of violence and discrimination and racism within Asian communities, and really within all communities, regardless of race or social class, right?